What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is David Ramsden-Wood here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And today I'm excited to be joined by Jill Evanko, who is the CEO of Chart Industries. Now, many of you may not be familiar with Chart Industries, and I myself had to do some reading, which dovetails with a lot of reading I've been doing on energy and hydrogen, etc. So first of all, Jill, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Thanks, David. I'm thrilled to be here, and we're doing very well. As you said, there's a lot of things going on in the business, so I'm excited to talk about it with you.
Yeah, and we don't usually talk a lot about financial results, but looks like from a 2020 perspective, you had, a whole bunch of record cash flow, record profits, record backlog orders. Talk to me about what Chart is and what business you've been building here over the last, number of years.
Yeah, we've definitely taken some strategic changes to the business over the last couple of years, but let me start with where we are today, and then I'll explain some of those changes. Today, we are the global leader in providing original equipment for industrial gas and clean energy end markets. And if you really boil it down, what we do is we make cryogenic equipment. And people say, well, what is that? Am I freezing somebody's head in a tank? And yes, you can do that. But what we do is we make the equipment that handles a variety of different molecules, typically at very low temperatures. And what that equates to is the ability to play in a variety of different applications, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's LNG, whether it's traditional oil and gas. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a real trend toward the movement of sustainability in the world. And that's played into our equipment being utilized in clean energy applications, clean water applications, wastewater, clean food and packaging. So we have equipment that goes into reducing the bottle of water and how much plastic goes into that. So we really pride ourselves on highly engineered equipment and being able to also service that after the fact, so a repair and service footprint. And we do this across the globe. So over the last few years, we've added multiple different manufacturing facilities through both organic investments and acquisitions. And now we have massive amounts of manufacturing capabilities in China, India, 9 locations in Europe, and various different locations in the States. So that allows us to really serve the entirety of this movement toward cleaner power is kind of at the crux of what we offer.
So you can imagine I have a lot of questions. I'm going to start basic because I actually want to tie it a little bit to COVID. I had Vicky Hollub on the podcast in August, and one of the things that she had talked about was, the work from home made sense for a period of time, but the lack of collaborations. Clearly, you're a growing company. You're all over the world, so there's probably some elements of work from home versus not. But I just wanted to start it with, how did you run your organization? How big is your organization? How many offices? How did you balance work from home versus not? And what are you planning on doing in 2021 and beyond to help adapt or modify or do the same thing for your business as you've done before?
Sure. So we have 4,200 team members around the world. About half are in the U.S. and half outside the U.S. And we have 26 different manufacturing locations around the globe. So you can imagine, as kind of COVID, you saw it roll through various different countries, that each one had different requirements. The number one premise that we have as a company is safety first. So that was really important that we made sure that we put the right protocols in place. But dovetailing with that, we were considered in each of our 26 locations to be essential manufacturing. What that means, and what that was very specific to in COVID time, was we do make equipment that, as I commented, molecule agnostic equipment, and our equipment is utilized for medical grade oxygen. And that was used in hospitals, it was used in medical mobile transports for field hospitals, nursing homes, you name it. So for us, it was really critical that we had our workforce get to work and be able to ramp up production to save lives. So that was a key part of us staying open throughout the pandemic. But what we did was we sent office employees home that could work from home and could work remotely. And while it's certainly, we've certainly all learned that Zoom and Teams is somewhat effective, you still do miss that personal interaction. And as a leadership team, we really felt like we can't say, all right, if you are a shop team member of ours, you have to come to work, but I'm going to sit home while you come to work. So it was really important that as a leadership team, we were out there on the shop floor with our team members that were coming to work every day. But we did put a lot of protocol in place around mask wearing, around temperature taking, staggering shifts, spacing out machinery and equipment, and also obviously followed government protocol depending on where you were located. So for 2021, we have nearly all of our workforce back. There are some people that working from home is fine, and we always had that previous to COVID. So we'll continue that capability because there is a level of attracting talent where if you can work remotely and you're effective at it, that's okay by us. But generally speaking, our approach go forward this year is to try to reinvigorate the person-to-person interaction and do that as well with our customers. And we've seen that the first couple of months of 2021, the customer activity in face-to-face meetings has been pretty active, which is great because you do accomplish a lot more when you're trying to get a deal done by sitting in the same room and hammering that out.
Yeah, one of the things I've been wondering, and maybe it's less so from your business because maybe your competitors are in a slightly different space and you're working a different angle. But I've sort of had the view that the people who are most interested in being in the office are also very social. They're also probably the business development and the salespeople. And as soon as the world reopens and they can get back out full force travel, it's going to be a knife fight for business because there's such pent up demand. And I think maybe in 2020, a lot of people just stayed with their existing suppliers because going through May, April, June, how do I change suppliers? How do I pick things? So you roll everything forward. Do you agree that 2021 and beyond is going to kind of be a knife fight, and that even more so than maybe some of the safety protocols and vaccine or no vaccine or whatever, but at the end of the day, the business is going to morph to whatever the customer needs? Or do you think it really is a new normal and things will change? I'm curious your perspective as a CEO of a very large international organization.
I think it's a little bit of both, to be straightforward on my answer. The first part is that some of the larger customers that are, significantly larger customers and global organizations had really shut everything down. To the extent of, hey, you can't go more than 100 miles from your home in a vehicle without permission. So I think that definitely there's pent up demand for those types of customers that their field service guys need to get back out. And that for us is a positive. The other side of that, though, is throughout the pandemic, we've seen some of the smaller companies and smaller customers and distributors that are regional say, hey, I'm going to take this opportunity that while big guy A is shut down, I'm going to go out and I'm going to generate some business and maybe take some market share. So we've seen a little bit of shift in profile of the customers. And I'm not sure if that's temporary or if that's going to kind of right size itself over this coming year. And then I do think there's an aspect that is we do have a little bit of a new normal, but coupling some of this recovery and coming out of the pandemic. And I do think, you start to see oil price come back. You're going to see that happen even more when planes start flying more. That coupled with this whole market movement toward this ESG and sustainability targets and concepts is really a good thing for the chart business overall. And the customer behaviors, I also think, are going to be very regionalized, and that's something that, being a global company is both good and bad. You have multiple levers to pull, but you also have multiple different scenarios to manage. It'll be interesting to see our peers too, whether they have whiplash on things like travel and expense, categories. And we've been pretty careful all along to make sure that if we are traveling, there's people that you can only send 2 at a time, things like that. But I think there's some whiplash built up in terms of costs and expenses, and that's going to have to be managed by each respective company.
So let's talk about the business, and in particular, I've been reading a lot about hydrogen and thinking about it. And it's actually funny, I believe you have a partnership with Ballard Power Systems. My sister, as an intern in Vancouver, British Columbia in around 1997 or 8, worked for Ballard as her first job. So I found it interesting, but I know with the fuel cells and hydrogen, and I hear a lot of people say it's just, commerciality of it isn't there. 99% of the world's hydrogen, as I understand it, is produced from natural gas as opposed to from water, and that the bulk of use is in big industrial heavy trucks with 4,000-pound tanks, 80,000-pound vehicles. Talk to me about hydrogen, the hydrogen business, the clean element of that, the makeshift, what goes into it. I understand it's a lot of energy to synthesize hydrogen. You're the expert, so regale us with tales.
Well, so you are absolutely correct that about 95% of the world's hydrogen today is SMR blue or produced from natural gas. And, I guess stepping back, what I would say is the hydrogen phenomenon really started back in May of 2020. From the chart perspective, we've been making hydrogen equipment for over 50 years, and nobody really cared about it till last May, which is interesting because it's similar and different to other molecules and other power sources in terms of its evolution. And I think probably the number one thing that plays into what's happening in the market today, it has nothing to do with logic. It has everything to do with peer pressure. So if you compare hydrogen to like LNG, it has similar fits and starts over the last decades. And you had pure play guys, industry guys that were dedicated to, I'm going to do green hydrogen and I'm going to figure it out and it's going to be part of the future. And that was the same with LNG. That's kind of how it unfolded. But LNG has always stayed in a very tight industry pocket, which is fine, and it's part of the total hybrid solution that currently exists and will continue to exist. But in hydrogen, what you're seeing is if you think of any company's name, I guarantee you they will have put something out on hydrogen, and was never the case with any other fuel or any other power source. So if Google says something, Amazon will. If Microsoft does, GM will. And so you have this whole series of what I deem peer pressure, probably not the right phrase, but a lot more standard companies are exploring how to utilize hydrogen as part of the solution. What I would say is the challenge to hydrogen, though, is what you commented on, is the cost comparison to traditional fossil fuels and its level of green on the green scale. But what is common in the space right now, whether it's hydrogen or green LNG or carbon capture, is that everyone is focused on taking steps, maybe not going from A to Z immediately, meaning from diesel to green hydrogen, but everyone's focused on taking steps to achieve these carbon emission reduction targets that are out there, both governments as well as in the private domain. And right or wrong, everybody, lots of these governments and private industry folks have put a 2050 target out, but then almost all of them also put a 2030 target out. And the only way you're going to get there is through a combination of SMR blue hydrogen, some cleaner carbon credit activities, and in my opinion, carbon capture has to be a key part of that evolution.
Yeah, so I'm still very curious about the hydrogen market, but you raised carbon capture. We've seen Oxy as an example really move. Exxon's moved the same way. Chevron's moved the same way. That this carbon capture business is going to be huge. Now, one of the challenges that I see is that CO2 floods in highly fractured reservoirs like the Permian, I struggle with. So it's more of a conventional business or just a downright storage where you're just injecting CO2 into old depleted conventional reservoirs. It's not really ever going to do anything. It's just going to stay there and be down there. Where is the technology at on it? Where is cryo? How does your company play a role in carbon capture? And what is the future of carbon capture broadly? I mean, is it possible to take coal plants and suck the CO2 emissions off with some of the NOx and SOx and just inject them down reservoirs with the same technology? Or where's the technology going?
Yeah. So there's really three types of technology on the capture side. The two of them are post-combustion carbon capture technology, one being cryogenic, the other being amine. And then there's direct air capture. So I shelved the direct air capture. We do direct air capture quite frequently, but that's really not solving for existing asset utilization of CO2 or atmospheric emission of CO2. Direct air capture really takes the CO2 out of atmosphere and then uses it in an application for power source. So if you focus in on the post-combustion carbon capture, which is really what the major international oil companies are looking at and saying, hey, I have these existing assets, what am I going to do with the CO2? We have process technologies, both owned as well as with investments, that couple very well with our air-cooled heat exchangers. And I'd point out that air-cooled heat exchangers are by far the number one most important piece of equipment in a carbon capture application. So, from when this thing takes off, we're in a good position as a company, but back to when is it going to take off? How is it going to happen? I think that we've made progress as an industry around demonstration size projects. So there's a lot of, I'm going to try it out, and it's kind of 10 to 30 ton per day sizes, which at the end of the day are just not commercially viable. They're more testing it out. How's this going to work? Does it work? How do I handle methane leaks and all the accompanying, the what ifs. The other piece of it is the storage side, as you suggest. In the States, that's easy. You have plenty of underground storage capabilities, plenty of space in West Texas and in the Permian, et cetera. In Europe, that's a whole different problem. The geology in Europe does not allow for the storage the way that you would expect. So directionally, what we're seeing is end users, industrial end users that have a use for CO2 are the ones thinking through, how do I put a capture process into an existing facility, and then I'll basically have a closed loop cycle, utilize the CO2 that's captured and put it back into whatever application. So number one application that is out there is on cement or concrete curing. But I think that you're going to see more and more of this happen across the industrials. If you step back and you look at CO2 as a whole in 2020, carbon dioxide you couldn't get it. I mean, it was needed for a lot of applications, and there was a shortage of it, which is just ironic considering the conversation we're having. But it's used in dry ice, it's used in firefighting, it's used in food preservation, it's used in concrete curing, and the list goes on. So I do think that there's going to be a good sense of application for it, but the first places that are going to be able to put it into actual use are the ones that have the ability to reuse it on site. So that's the key there.
Well, and one of the things that seems really hard to me about the whole concept really is that, especially since we're going to be built, like without rebuilding infrastructure that already exists, but you're going to have the end user of CO2. And I think about in Canada, when the Weyburn oil field, and it was in Canada at the time, had to build like a 200 or 300 mile pipeline to, I believe it was a fertilizer plant that made something like 180 million cubic feet a day of CO2. And through this pipeline, and of course, CO2 is highly corrosive, and how do you manage that? But just from a unless you're right next to a coal plant, natural gas is burned in people's homes. Maybe you capture some of the tailings from a natural gas power plant, but we continue to move in a direction where, those aren't being built. They're probably isolated from other industrial use. And then, as you said, the underground capture, and in particular in Europe, like it seems like one of those, like it's a nice thing to say, and the technology will probably get there. But unless you're just able to suck CO2 out of the air wherever you are close to an application, that seems like the game-changing technology, but it also sounds incredibly expensive. Do I think about that the right way?
Well, I think there's elements of that we would agree with, but there's also elements where you have to solve. There's no way you're going to hit a 30% carbon emission reduction target in the next 10 years unless you're actually finding a way to capture what you're emitting, or to your point, right, ripping out existing assets. And so the utilization of the existing infrastructure is really what that carbon capture is trying to solve for. The carbon capture itself right now is certainly less expensive than direct air capture. So taking it directly out of the air and utilizing it. But I do think that the direct air capture is going to be, it's going to rival it. But if you have existing assets, you can't do direct air capture and solve the problem you're trying to solve for. So I think it's really around, if I didn't have to address my carbon footprint, I agree with everything you just said. As a company, I do have to address my carbon footprint, and if I'm going to keep operating my existing assets, I'm going to have to find a way to capture what I'm emitting and do something with it. In terms of the pipelines and how the metallurgy works and the safety around it, that's really not the issue. To your point, comes down to cost. And that cost is being driven down every day. I think you're going to see that more and more as it scales. So to me, the size of carbon capture facilities is going to become bigger and bigger instead of these smaller footprints. Whereas I think the opposite occurs with some of the other molecules like hydrogen, where the more you can do kind of a hub and spoke model or a smaller scale model, the more effective your network becomes. But both of these conversations are still really embryonic, and I think there's still really a lot of innovation in the space happening, and kind of like we say internally, right? Where do you want to place your bet on the roulette wheel of any of this? Because there's a variety of different potential outcomes.
Well, one of the things that I've read, and you can maybe confirm, so we're going to switch back to methane because methane is used to make hydrogen, and I want to learn more about that. But methane emissions, from an oil and gas perspective, methane emissions certainly, I believe the numbers are roughly 80 times the greenhouse gas impact that even CO2 has. So a minor reduction in methane emissions has a huge impact, even relative to CO2, which, even though we've defined it as a pollutant, and I hate to sound like a cynic, but like we all exhale CO2 and plants all inhale. So we've sort of made the boogeyman CO2, even though incrementally water vapor has a huge greenhouse gas emission. And we never talk about water as a pollutant because that's just crazy talk. But methane 100% is. And I'm curious what technologies you have both for methane capture, maybe the LNG, small scale LNG off of venting, or some of the new technologies emerging there, and then go to hydrogen and walk me through how hydrogen is made from natural gas and how it's more or less energy intensive to take it, create it, and then burn hydrogen versus just burning the methane in the first place.
Sure. So, we're definitely a leader in terms of addressing methane leaks, and that goes to the capability that we have on the equipment itself, but also some of the innovation we have around the interlinkages of processes and the balance of plant to our equipment, and where, if you can cut down on the weld in between, you really have the ability to cut down on where the leak could occur. The other thing that is really unique offering that we have, and this is just one example because we have multiple depending on the product that you have, is a concept called smart layer, which goes into our heat exchangers. And the smart layer process actually detects a methane leak ahead of it hitting atmosphere. So it detects the inside of the equipment before it hits the layer that's going to go into atmosphere. There's a lot of reducing methane leakage is a very heightened focus in the industry itself. And, to your point, when you're talking about this, that's a great way to start solving your problem, is go in and figure out where I might have a leak in this set of equipment or this interplay of equipment in my plant. And you're starting immediately to address the problem at hand, or the perceived problem at hand. And then around kind of the technology and the innovation and where that's going on small scale terminals. And what we're seeing more and more on the small scale LNG side of things, in addition to the leak detection systems, is molecule ready types of facilities that we're working on and building. And that goes to the liquefaction process. So if you can liquefy one molecule, you can find ways and processes to liquefy more than one molecule. And what that'll allow for is, as evolution of hydrogen and natural gas together play more and more, and one of the key topics in the industry right now is blending hydrogen into natural gas pipelines, and how much of that can you do, and does that kind of address what you're saying, which is hydrogen's really expensive, but it also has some characteristics that are cleaner than just straight up natural gas. And the target for a lot of our customers is kind of 30 to 35% blending of hydrogen into natural gas pipelines by 2035. So you get a sense that, where we are today is you can blend, it's kind of industry agreed, you can blend 15 to 20% hydrogen in right now, and that works, but doesn't really accomplish much. And the second being, there's a movement toward this, and having the equipment that can handle multiple molecules and detect leaks, which is both of what we provide, is a key part of setting up these types of terminals. And then in terms of the production of hydrogen, the storage of it, and the utilization of it, there's varying levels on the value chain of, do I use SMR blue, or am I just going to focus on doing green hydrogen? And right now it's really around the utilization as quickly as possible versus storing it. So that's kind of the current industry mentality. We're seeing more and more, though, kind of large scale production facilities, and then they have to store in storage tanks and transport it to the end use. Again, none of which yet is cost competitive. So I'd consider the industry still in an embryonic form and that's why you see a lot of the partnerships happening, is the more you can kind of offer and figure out this full solution instead of 20 different pieces of the value chain and trying to make margin on it. That way, that's how you're going to be able to address this issue at hand. But green is a 10-year type of evolution.
So walk me through the use of natural gas pipelines to transport hydrogen in some sort of blend. That sort of envisions that there's going to be some plant upstream that's taking feedstock natural gas, and instead of it being sent to homes to heat or to power plants to create power, you're incrementally doing something to create hydrogen and blending it. Is that happening on, you talked about a 15% accepted standard now. Is that happening a lot? And what is the physical, like when I burn hydrogen, do I have to re-separate it from methane? I imagine it would have a lower equivalent BTU content if I'm thinking about the molecules correctly.
Yes, you're thinking about it correctly. And what's happening, I wouldn't say it's extremely widespread, but where we're seeing most of the hydrogen blending in the current state is from utility companies. So it's happening in Hawaii, it's happening in Ireland. And so a lot of what is more public policy driven, and that again goes to these kind of 10 to 20 year goals that are out there. The biggest challenge and again, this is the people that handle the molecule. The two biggest challenges are the metallurgy or the embrittlement of having hydrogen go through a natural gas pipeline. And that's not an easy problem to solve. You can solve it with money, but you can't really solve it effectively on an economic basis yet. From our perspective, the biggest issue are the ends of the pipeline because of how it moves in and out. The other challenge is unless you have continuous flow, that's certainly something that the blending, the fits and starts of it can create issues.
So then you have embrittlement on the top because the hydrogen would be a lighter, H2 would be lighter than CH4 if I remember my chemistry correctly from my engineering degree.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So those are the types of challenges that are being solved out there. And then again, there's a group of companies and industries and governments that are saying, all right, let's try this green concept and go right to that and skip, if we can, skip over the blending portion and the utilization and the combination of molecules. My view is it's going to be a hybrid of all of the above. And that's again, really good thing for our business because we don't care. we don't have a horse in the race of what somebody chooses for their power source. We do care that we have equipment that handles all of it. And I think from an industry perspective, it's really important that the industries collaborate, and we're seeing much more of that happening these days, in particular in hydrogen, and that'll at least give it a fighting chance to be cost competitive and scalable.
It is fascinating to think about the technology, and to close on hydrogen. Is it fair for me to think about, I mean, if our true goal is to stop carbon emissions, if that's the goal, it's the stated goal, whether you agree with it or not, that's the stated goal. I mean, it would seem to me that if I am correct on the term hydrolysis, which would be the act of separating water into hydrogen and oxygen, right? It would seem that would be the right answer. And is it fair to say that the most plentiful source of water for that is the ocean, and the most plentiful source of power to do that would be offshore wind farms? Like, is that sort of the integration where you would take offshore wind farms, create the mass electricity, and whenever it blew, you would take all that free electricity for all intents and purposes, break apart the oxygen, hydrogen, hope stuff doesn't blow up, and then figure out a way to transport it to the end user? I mean, is that fair? Am I thinking about that right? Again, it's been a long time since I've thought about this, but
yeah, yes, in a much simplified manner from what you described, absolutely. And the other thing I would say is, well, hydrogen is flammable. It's also a quick burn. So there's a lot of characteristics to, in particular, liquid hydrogen that make it safer than some other molecules that you might be dealing with. But yes, that's what you just lined out is absolutely accurate, and we are seeing a lot of wind solar combination projects to hydrogen. And one of the interesting things that we see, and we're again similarly around that kind of linkage to clean water and clean power, is in a lot of cases you have to at least treat the water in order for it to be clean enough to address green in the hydrogen sense. And where there's I think the biggest challenge with wind and solar is simply what everybody talks about, which is it's just not consistent and available at the levels that are needed. And so how do you kind of couple these things together? Because I do think wind and solar are part of the solution, exactly as you described. So more and more of that interlinkage between renewables versus something standing on its own. And yes, the ocean is definitely, anything that you can do close around that, where you can bring the water in from that perspective, is going to be better positioned.
Final subject for today, LNG. I mean, we've seen it grow massively around the world. We've seen new terminals being built. Well, we've seen the US, which, I mean, I don't know if you ever thought we'd get to 11 BCF a day of exports, but we've really managed what is a very, very, very low natural gas price environment in the United States, because we were able to export 3 and then 6 and most recently 11 BCF a day. Where does the LNG market go, and where does the technology evolve on the ships that are moving it around the world, and how do you play a role in that today and in the future?
Yeah, yes. And I would say, I think while 2020 was difficult for LNG, in particular in the United States, just given nothing happened, it's probably a good thing for the future of the next few years and how it plays in part. I see a movement toward the spot market for LNG, and it's definitely cost competitive, definitely scalable. And what that means is there's going to be kind of a different model, but it doesn't take away from the need for supply. And so 2020 shed a lot of the outlier potential projects in LNG, just for the sheer fact that if you weren't through regulatory approvals, you're you're treading upstream. And so now you're down to a handful, 10, 12 projects around the globe that are going to be the ones that get constructed in the next 4 years and provide the supply for it. So I think pricing remains competitive, if not it gets even better on it. And certainly even yesterday, right, there was a Tokyo Clean LNG Alliance got announced with 14 different companies or 15 different companies, including Isuzu and Mitsubishi and Tokyo Gas, saying, listen, LNG is carbon neutral LNG. Let me be clear on that. Is an important part of our next few years, because all these other things that are happening in the background, we believe in them and we're going to invest in them, but they're going to take some time. So the premise of everything we've talked about today bodes really well for LNG in the first half of this decade.
What's the difference between carbon neutral and normal LNG?
So the real difference is how a carbon credit system works. And so the carbon credit system can help regular LNG.
So it's the concept of net. It's like where Google says they're net zero, but they need their servers on all the time. So they're actually using fossil fuels, but buying credits to offset their carbon footprint. So it's the net zero concept around LNG using the credit market.
That's right. I mean, and there's some other things happening to address, can you make green LNG? But ultimately right now it is around the carbon credit system.
Okay. It is a fascinating business, and you guys have been absolutely blowing and going. And I hope you crush 2021 like you did 2020. Personally, any huge learnings or things that you took personally out of 2020 that it's gonna change you go forward in terms of the way you think about people or problems or anything? Any learnings you can share with us?
I think, one of the things is you can't really underestimate all the people you have around you and how they'll step up to a challenge. And our team has just done a yeoman's job of being nimble and agile and so on. And the other thing is that I think it's really hard when you have to make hard decisions of talent and letting people go. And if you ever start thinking that's easy, then you really need to quit your job and be done with it and go do something else. because those are tough decisions, and they should be tough decisions because you're changing people's lives. So keeping that in mind, and how that impacts the business and how every decision you make impacts someone's life is super important, I think, as a leader.
Well, I love that. Jill, thank you so much for joining us on the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And I look forward to hearing the catch up at the end of 2021. So thank you.
Thanks, David.
All right. Until next time, this is the Hot Take of the Day podcast. You can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. Write a 5-star review, because the only way we get these messages out and have these conversations in person, since we know they're not happening in the media, is for us to have long form podcast discussion. 5-star ratings do that for us. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye for now.